Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where followers of Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one thing that is happening in our American political world is the politicization of the border. If you are following the political news, you will find that more and more news stories and politicians are capitalizing on the issue of what is happening in immigration, especially at the border. It's happening now, and I predict it's going to intensify in the 2024 election season. And this is why I especially wanted to help our listeners to make sense of this issue correctly with as much biblical as well as factual information, because there's a tremendous amount of distortion that is happening on the issue of what is actually happening on the border. It's an issue that is really dear to my heart. I am an immigrant myself. I immigrated to this country when I was 3 years old, so I know how amazing it is to have an experience of being welcomed into this country, and how devastating it would be to be turned away and to sorry, let me take it up. This is an issue that's very dear to my heart. I am an immigrant myself. I immigrated to this country when I was 3 years old, so I know the great blessings of this country, and I know also how devastating it is to not experience welcome in this country. So it is important to me. I think it's important to Christians. If you are at all familiar with your Bible, the Old Testament is just filled constantly with this injunction to take care of the alien, the stranger, and the foreigner in your midst. In the biblical vision, we are told to understand that how we embody the welcoming presence of God to us is by extending that welcome to the alien, the fatherless, the foreigner, precisely who would be immigrants to us today in our present context, many of them who are coming in the border. So we need to help to make biblical sense and also factual sense of what is happening at the border. And so we're going to actually take two episodes, this episode released this week and another episode next week, with two different guests to help us make sense of the border. And my guest today is Bri Stensrud, who is the director of this ministry called Women of Welcome. Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. The Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And our podcast is a place where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one thing that's happening in the world is that people are migrating. People are seeking refuge. And in particular, in the American world, the issue of immigration and of what is happening at the border is a critical issue about how we make sense of the world. And so joining me today is Bri Stensrud, the director of Women of Welcome, a ministry that is helping women, especially Christian women in America, make sense of this part of the world. Bri, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. Well, Bri, let's get right into it. Please describe for us, what is Women of Welcome? What do you guys do?
Yeah, Women of Welcome is really a partnership. It's a project between World Relief, which is, as most people know, probably a lot of your listeners know, is the official humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. So World Relief does global relief all across the world. And then you have the National Immigration Forum, who is a nonpartisan advocacy entity out of DC. And these two entities, one who is Christian and one who is not, and them coming together and saying, we need to change the narrative about vulnerable people, particularly refugees and immigrants. And so what they did is they partnered together and said, what should we do? And there's some interesting background as to how this all formulated, but they created Women of Welcome together. And so there are supporting partners. And Women of Welcome is a community of Christian women who seek to engage the Bible holistically to inform us on authentic hospitality and welcome of the sojourner.
And programmatically, what does this look like? I mean, because I understand there's actual trips and exposure to the border that takes place. Describe all of that for us.
Yeah, so our community does three basic things. We have encouragement. There's a lot of women who have just God-given compassion about vulnerable people, and yet they're not exactly sure where to go with it because the narrative about immigrants and refugees can be so inflamed and so unhelpful. So there's encouragement. You're not alone. You can explore this subject matter from a biblically orthodox point of view, and we're all in this together. We all have different starting places, but let's go on this journey together. Then we have education, where we have tons of educational videos, whether that be how to decipher the headlines. What do we know from expert theologians, from Border Patrol? What do we know from the current administration that's in office? So we have a lot of education around that. And then we have equipping. And equipping is, okay, if we really want to change a narrative, if we want to change the world, if we want to reach people for Jesus, what does that look like? Some of that looks like being equipped to have better conversations, which means we have to get in closer proximity to people. So we have immersion trips in which you can sign up to go with our community and be hosted by someone who's on the ground and who locally does this. And we immerse ourselves in proximity and language. And then there's other ways we get close where we'll take women to Washington, D.C., where you can use your voice to advocate on Capitol Hill with your elected officials, because we all know that loving our neighbors well in America usually means you have to get involved in some way in politics, not partisan politics. We're very, very strict on being nonpartisan, but we also believe that public policy has huge, that's a huge area for us to be involved in. So this is what we do. We do encouragement, we do equipping, and we do education.
So let's talk about that exposure, because I'm really interested in these immersion trips. Describe what
Mhm.
happens on those. How long are they? What do they get to experience? Yeah, tell us about that.
So, an immersion trip, and I like to call them immersion experiences, and I think many of us who grew up in the church are very familiar with missions trips. And
Mhm.
missions trips, usually how we were framed kind of in the white evangelical, subculture, was really we are going to help this village somewhere, whether that be in Haiti or Mexico or in Venezuela. I've been to Caracas, a couple times, and it was like we were going to go do something. We were going to go help people, and a lot of the times it was kind of like the attitude was really they need us, and we are going to be bringing God to that place because these people are less fortunate than we are and probably don't know as much as we do. Now, that wasn't like always explicitly said, but we had that feeling like we are going to go and save some people, this whole white savior kind of complex.
Mhm.
And, as we all grow and learn and mature, we realize that in these kind of messy, marginalized spaces, God is already there. And
Mhm.
there are already people who are doing amazing work that don't necessarily, sometimes we do need to go, but that don't necessarily need all of us to come over with all of our things,
Sure.
but they need our friendship and they need our relationship. And maybe they need our financial support because they just don't have those same mechanisms where they are. So these immersive experiences that we go on are not missions trips. We are going to sit and learn. We're not going to go and do. We're going to get close to people who have walked through a lot of pain, and we're going to try and walk in the same shoes as much as we can. It's so very difficult, but walk in the same places that we are. So we go down to the border and we entrust ourselves to local partners. So in Southern California, we entrust ourselves to World Relief. They have an amazing SoCal office down there that does immersive experiences. When we go to El Paso, Texas, there's an amazing ministry down there called Ibarra Frontiers. And we entrust ourselves and our ladies to these partners who live, breathe, work in those neighborhoods along the borderlands. And we talk with migrants and pastors on the US side, and we cross the border and we talk with migrants, and we go to shelters and we talk with pastors on the Mexico side. We meet with Border Patrol. I mean, when I say that we are nonpartisan, I mean, I'm an equal opportunity critic, so I don't
Mhm.
care who's in office. If you
Yeah.
say that you are a Christ follower and we are weak on something politically, I'm going to call you about it because I want to hold you to that and I want us to do better, right? So we meet
So
with
on
Border
these trips,
Patrol.
how long do they last? And yeah, tell us.
Yeah. So our trips generally are for, well, they're all for women. Women of Welcome, obviously,
Mhm.
is for women. And so a lot of women have a very hard time. They're so interested and they want to know what they can do and they want to get close. It's very hard for women to detangle from home life and
Mhm.
kids and all of the things. So,
Sure.
I mean, I would love to have an immersive experience that's 5 days long. That's not
Mhm.
realistic for the women
Okay.
we're asking to engage in this space. And so we just have to keep that in mind. And so it's a 2 day trip. You're having a
Okay.
4 days total, but it's
Uh-huh.
really 2 days from like 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. I'm running you around, introducing you to everybody who you would never meet and that the news rarely talks to.
Okay. And describe to me what happens for these women on these trips. How do they come in? How do they leave? What's going on for them as they go through this?
You know, it's so very interesting because I learned very early on that I have a specific role, and it is not to be the Holy Spirit. I
Mhm.
don't, on these trips, need to conjure up anything. I don't need to play off people's emotions. Frankly, you know, Curtis, when I go and we invite a lot of high profile people to come, we have really privatized trips and we have more public trips for our community members. But really, the attitude is just come and see what God's doing. He's down here already. We're not bringing him anywhere. And so you have people showing up with a lot of fear and
Mhm.
a lot of questions, because what we see is what the news shows us. And there's always some sort of agenda in the news, right? And so you have, you know, some of our ladies, you know, they're coming from more conservative backgrounds. And so their families really aren't on board with them coming to this kind of
Mhm.
experience. They're very nervous. I talk with husbands on the phone about what we do for security. And I get calls about like, my husband doesn't want me to go on the Mexico side. Can I still come? No, we really can't, because that's a full day of what we're doing. And
Right.
we're gonna have to take on a little bit of risk to get close to people who are risking everything to come to the
So you
US.
guys on your trip go on both sides of the border. You actually cross the border and
Yes.
experience what it's like on the other side as well. Okay, that's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that seems to be one that particularly might spark some fear or
Well, it makes
concern.
people nervous when you think
Yeah,
about like what the news shows you about what's going on at the border. You're
yeah,
like, wait, I, I'm so interested, but you're going to take me where that looks super chaotic. And
yeah,
it never is always as it appears. So
yeah.
people come in with a lot of questions, and they also come in with a lot of, you know, really a lack of support from sometimes their church community
Yeah.
and sometimes their families. I had a lady that came on a trip and her dad dropped her off at the airport, and he said, well, you know, pardon what I'm about to say, but this is kind of where a lot of our
Yeah.
ladies are existing and coming from. But he said, all right, well, go have fun helping all those illegals over the fence.
Right.
And
Right.
that was what she was coming from. And so, what I have to keep in mind when we're hosting these trips is that we have to equip women to go back to that dad who's going to pick them up
Mm,
from the airport and be
right.
like, oh, I bet you just talked to a bunch of bleeding hearts down there. And, you know, it's like, no, we're going to talk to law enforcement. We're going to talk to city officials. We're going to really get as full of a picture as possible, so that when you go home, not only are you going to meet with people that will feel like a great validation to your people back at home, but that will hopefully give you enough information to have more confident conversations when you get home.
Yeah. Give me a sense of the scale in a given year. How many women are you taking on these trips?
Well, that really, you know, depends on budget from year to year, but
Sure.
we have over 150,000 women in our community, and
Okay.
every year we take anywhere from 2 to 4 trips.
Okay.
And women can apply for those trips on our website and through our social. We always announce that on our social media, and then we just kind of pray over and select. It's kind of like a lottery. There are other trips where, you know, my really good friend Jamie Ivy, she went on a trip with me 3 years ago, and she has done co-trips ever since. So
Okay.
ever since then, she's been like, she's a podcaster. She's like, I want to offer this to my podcast audience. And so we'll take a group of her podcast listeners across the border. And then we'll take a group of maybe a bunch of Jamie's friends that she knows have influence or authors or whatnot. And we go down and we do another trip. So you can do a co-trip with Women of Welcome if you're interested in that.
Okay.
And also you can just be a part of our community and go with other like-minded women.
Okay. So is it a couple hundred, more than that, less than that, a
Oh,
year of
like to
folks?
go, like
Yeah. Every
financially?
year. I'm just trying to get a
Oh,
sense of the scale. How many women are experiencing this in a
oh,
given
right.
year
So you
at the
have,
height, let's say?
yeah. So like 15 to 20 women at a time. We really
Okay.
try and curate these trips
Okay.
in the fact that they're very intimate. And so if you're having 4 trips with 20 women, you know.
Okay. So tell me, the way you're describing it sounds like these women are kind of often outliers in their home community, home church, in terms of their interest in immigration and the border. Give me
Mm.
the profile of these women. Why them? What happened for them such that they would be even willing to consider going on a trip, or even if they aren't one of the few that go on the trip, that they would at least get involved with Women of Welcome? Like, why these folks strike me as as folks, I would love to be in the Good Faith podcast because they seem like exile people, people who are not a bit homeless culturally and politically in their home, but are now going to meet other people who literally are homeless. And I just love that picture. So help me understand, what's going on for
What the
these women, such
community?
that
Yeah.
such that they've become these at least culturally or politically exiled folks in their own community.
So, I mean, the way that we really kind of sum up our community is we have really a mix of women in the fact that everybody is coming to the subject matter on a journey. And it is not an agenda of ours to get you from point A to point Z, but just to not leave you where you are. So we have concerned conservatives, we have engaged evangelicals, and they're all still most of them self-identified evangelicals, so they're very
Mhm.
well connected and plugged into church, but they're probably at a church that's not speaking up about the issues of immigration. Their
Okay.
church is probably talking about abortion, but their
Mhm.
church probably isn't talking a lot about other human dignity issues, but there is like a hunger for it. You have lots of these women who have adopted minority children.
I see.
You have a
Okay.
lot of these women who serve and volunteer in their local communities, or they've been on missions trips and they have fallen in love with certain people and certain
Yeah.
places and countries. And so these are women who are highly connected in their church, who love Jesus and have no discipleship on how to engage with the ever constant topic of immigrants and refugees that are coming up, to our border or globally. And so this
Yeah.
is a place for Christian women to really explore, what does the Bible say? And let's think about this from a biblical perspective
Yeah.
first instead of a political perspective.
Yeah. So, why did you guys limit this to women? What is it about what is it? Yeah, because I want to join. I want to be part of this. So,
Well, that's an interesting question, Curtis. What I would say is that men and women think very differently about things, and the way in which you engage them is very, very different.
Okay.
Women of welcome, and I would say particularly in really hot political topics, you have to
Hmm.
do that. I mean, I started out in the pro-life movement, and the way in which you would talk to and equip men is very different than you. I mean, there's some
Mm.
baseline, obviously, as far as biblical knowledge and, you know, how to talk with really hard and divisive conversations. But when it comes to like really emotionally connecting with people, there is a difference. Women of Welcome started just kind of out of nowhere in the fact that World Relief and the National Immigration Forum, who've done just work together for decades on helping to kind of ensure the flourishing from policy to programs for immigrants here in the US. During the height of the Trump administration, there was just really inflamed rhetoric around immigrants and refugees, and immigrants and refugees were being meshed together. And so refugees used to be this really uncontroversial population of people that the church was always welcoming of, and like, oh my goodness, they're our brothers
Yeah.
and sisters, we need to get them to the US. But then during the previous administration, that all got muddled together with illegal activity that was happening down at the border and asylum seekers that were showing up and trying to cross the border legally to find an officer to seek asylum. So it just got really messy and very, very inflamed. The rhetoric was very dehumanizing. And so World Relief was kind of nervous, and they were like, man, evangelicals' thoughts and attitudes about immigrants and refugees is changing vastly. We got to see how bad this is. So basically, the Forum and World Relief got together and they commissioned Lifeway Research to do a study. How bad is it, basically? Like, and what they found out is that the vast majority of self-identified evangelicals were being framed by the media about what they thought about immigrants and refugees instead of their faith.
Mm.
And faith, like their Bible, their pastor, there was like, it was low and media was like high. And
Yeah.
so it was frightening to realize not only was, our lack of biblical understanding, it was pairing with kind of these old school cultural wars that was happening, right? And in the middle were all these vulnerable people who people were starting to disengage from. And
Yeah.
so what they found in that research when they separated out the genders, it was just so interesting, is that while white self-identified evangelical men were really towing more of a partisan platform line, there were women, evangelical women, who had higher levels of compassion and empathy and a
Mm.
desire to learn, more than their male counterparts. And so what World Relief did is they said, okay, let's just put out a Bible study and see if anybody is interested in. Like, is anyone talking to this group of women who this research says has higher levels of compassion? No one was talking to them. So they put
Mm.
out a Bible study, and pretty much like within a matter of weeks, 35,000 women showed up in a Facebook group.
Oh my
How do we
gosh.
learn
Wow.
more? Are there more? What else can we do? And that's really kind of where Women of Welcome was born. It was like the research bore out that there were compassionate evangelical women with no place to go, and no one was talking to them. And there was a Bible study that put out, and then really kind of Women of Welcome
Okay.
was born. It's like, all right, Christian women want to be discipled on this, and so we're going to go and run with that.
Bri, tell us your story. Why did you get involved in it? What were you doing before this, and why were you drawn to it? And what's happened for you as you've been leading this effort?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a crazy story in the fact that I was working for Focus on the Family at the time, several years back, and I was the director of Sanctity of Human Life. So everything from adoption and orphan care and preborn life and sonograms in high risk abortion vulnerable communities. So all of that, I was really traveling the country recruiting families for kids who were languishing in foster care, and just really in that preborn adoption space world. And I stepped away from Focus to create some margin for my family to go through the adoption process. And when I was in that season of doing that, I got a call from World Relief, and they said, "We heard that you left Focus on the Family. What's going on? Would you be interested in getting close to this issue of immigration? We know you're a whole life pro-lifer. Have you ever gotten really close to this issue?" And I said, "No, not really, but that's intriguing." And so I said yes. And then I panicked that I said yes, because I was like, I know how my community feels about this issue. I know how my subculture feels about this community. I've never heard a sermon about this, so I started
Mm.
asking some
Well, and
pastors.
Bri, real quick, locate yourself regionally. Where are
Um,
you? What kind of church
I'm in
background are you
Colorado.
in?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm Colorado Springs, Colorado. I grew up
Okay.
in the
Oh, okay. You're at the
evangelical.
heart of the evangelical subculture.
I'm in the Mecca.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I grew up in an evangelical free church. My dad was an
Okay.
E-free pastor.
Okay.
He went to Dallas Theological Seminary. I went to Dallas Theological
Okay.
Seminary.
All
We are
right.
just steeped in this kind of
You're
conservative
you're
evangelical world.
you're ground zero. Okay. So
Yes,
and so
here I
you
am.
yourself are an example of somebody who
Yes.
um, has obviously a heart of compassion. That's why you got involved in the pro-life with a whole life, not specifically on abortion, but the whole person, the whole life. But even you did not get formed in any way to think biblically and also experience factually what's happening on the border. So it sounds like you're perfect. You represent actually your target
I am the
demographic.
audience. I am the
You are the
audience.
audience. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, in my work in the pro life movement, I was really mentored into this kind of whole life, pro life worldview, and where, we're all operating out of Genesis 1:27, that each and every person made in the image of God. And so when I thought about the immigrant and refugee conversation, just much like I thought about racial reconciliation or preventable disease challenges and world hunger, it was always that from the framework of each and every person is made in the image of God and has immeasurable worth and potential because of who they were created by.
Yeah.
And therefore that is how we should see people. Being pro-life is more about looking at each human being regardless of, personal opinion, political opinions, ethnicity, social status, whatever, as a unique image bearer. And yet I had still only scratched the surface of what the Lord really wanted me to understand about immigrants and refugees. And you can only
Bri,
do so much when you're that far.
yeah, but explain why, because the theology of I think a holistic whole life perspective is really rooted, like you said, in Genesis 1, the image
Mm-hmm.
of God, that every individual life has immeasurable dignity and worth in the eyes of God, and that's why we
Mm-hmm.
care for the unborn fetus. Especially because they're vulnerable, they're defenseless, and in the same way, the adult who is vulnerable, defenseless, uh, and without a home, just like the fetus is in some ways, is being deprived of their family home life. It's sort of, there's a mirroring there of a vulnerable life that can be easily dismissed as not having dignity and worth and value, and yet the Christian call is to recover that dignity and worth. That makes theological sense to me anyways, and I hopefully to many of our listeners. But why on the ground is there such the severe disconnect between
Mm-hmm.
pro-life that applies this, vision of the Imago Dei, to the fetus, but doesn't apply it to a vulnerable refugee. What's going on there? Why there's this disconnect?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think there is a lack of kind of holistic biblical understanding. I mean, that great book about misreading scripture with Western eyes, we have this evangelical culture that really over the years has formed us to care about certain things and then also think that other things are a slippery slope to things that are politically more progressive, and then that frightens people to get engaged. And so there's one about just our lack of biblical understanding. Every major character in the Bible is an immigrant, by the way. When you start
That's right.
rereading some of these
Yeah.
things in the Bible, you're like, oh my goodness, it's everybody.
Yeah.
And then I think the second thing is we have
from Abraham to Jesus, right? We're all refugees or immigrants. Yeah.
All of us.
Yeah.
All of us. And I mean, the next thing I would say is about narrative. I mean, really, the narrative that we are given about immigrants and refugees is that they are takers, that a lot of them are doing illegal things to be here, and they're poor and they're needy and they're wanting to take advantage of what America has worked so hard for, right? And so we all know that is we know that cannot be true, because these narratives compete against each other, and yet you really default back into what's most comfortable for you and what you know. And the only thing that actually really beats out a strong American media narrative is biblical knowledge and proximity. And that's the other thing. That's the third thing I would say is we have really lost our proximity to people in pain. We are out of practice on how to long suffer with people and what that even means, because relatively speaking, for us in America, we've got all kinds of like social traumas, but we don't have like huge, big cultural traumas like Civil War or massive like food deserts and poverty in the fact that you're being starved every single day and you only eat once a week or something like that, the places in Africa and whatnot. So our lack of proximity to people in pain, and we intentionally go out of our way in our evangelical culture to really protect ourselves from those things. We create a bubble. We get out kind of into the north side of town, and we go to certain schools. We've pulled our kids out of public schools, and I'm not saying anything about any of that. What I'm saying is we have done a great job of self-preservation, and what that does is has pulled us away from a lack of proximity. So you're very easily centered on the preborn issue, which has just been a long-standing thing that we know, and then as it's confirmed by science, about what's going on in the womb, you're just even more. But what you are also being discipled by is the news media. And then you're also being discipled by your own experiences, which do not include people who look like you or who have come from different places. And I think that those three things are quite the swirl that help us disconnect because it's comfortable. And we don't have anything that's fighting against that in our own spheres.
Yeah. Bri, when was the last time you were down at the border? If I could just get a sense of context here.
I've been down 3 times this year already, and I'm
3 times this year. Okay.
And I'm going to go next week as well.
Okay, excellent. All right. So you have talked about how American Christians are so much shaped by the media narrative about what's happening at the border. And I would summarize, at least in the conservative circles, the media narrative is our border is getting overrun. Like there are just masses of illegal immigrants, many of them bent for ill, or as you said, as takers or violent or with criminal records, swarming over the border. This is only slightly, I think, a caricature of what gets portrayed on conservative media. What's actually happening? You've been there 3 times this year. You're going there next week. Correct. If that image is incorrect, correct it for our listeners. What's really happening?
I mean, the reality is there's always some kind of sliver of truth in some of the media narrative, right? But the way in which it's framed and the footage in which is used is not always accurate, right? So what I would say about what's happening at the border is we know what's happening at the border statistically, because Border Patrol takes tally of all of those encounters that they have, all of the apprehensions that they have, their estimated amount of got-away numbers, which is people who elude the Border Patrol on purpose and they try and cross illegally. And we know what the Border Patrol says about what they need as far as, do they need more wall, or is that a waste of money in certain areas and certain regions, and they need technology in those spaces and whatnot. So we know from data what's happening, and we also know just from our partners on the ground what is happening. We do know that we have historic numbers of encounters at the southern border, and that is because honestly, the world is on the move. I mean, you can chalk that up to bad, administrative policies and whatnot. And some of that is true. And some of it is also a reality that we have a broken immigration system. And that's a whole nother podcast to get on. But really, Biden, much like Trump, much like anybody else, they cannot do anything about immigration reform. That's an act of Congress. And
Right.
so if you want something different at the border, you're going to have to call your elected official and say, you know what, we want more legal pathways for people. We want more budget to have more immigration
Yeah,
judges
Bri,
to
just stop
adjudicate
right
these
there
claims
because
fast.
because the reality is Congress is broken. Congress can't do anything right now, and so I
I
think that's the
know.
explanation for why we can't have immigration reform. Because exactly like you said, it runs through Congress, and Congress right now is locked in a complete partisan deadlock. Um, so okay, so we can't fix immigration, but it is like if you went down there right now, or you were
Mhm.
down there in your last trip, are the people just overrunning the border? Like paint the picture.
Yeah,
And
sure.
is that picture again same or different from this media, this especially in conservative circles, of this media picture of a border that's just out of control and being
Yeah.
overrun? Yeah.
So, first, I'll say what is true. What is true is that we are seeing historic numbers of people coming to the border. We are also seeing very tired and very overworked Border Patrol agents whose job it is to know what is coming in and out of the country. And they are doing their level best to keep up with the massive influx of people. You have 100 million globally displaced people. Around the world. So the world is on the move, and
Yeah.
we are not immune to that as the
Yeah.
United States of America. People
Yeah.
will find their way to what they know
Well,
is
especially
freedom.
the level of political instability and violence, especially
Yes.
violence that is overrunning Mexico, Central America. These are
Yeah.
people who are fleeing really horrible situations, right,
Right.
Bri?
Right.
Yeah.
So at the border, you have these historic numbers. That's very true. We have very tired and overworked Border Patrol agents. That's also very true. There is human trafficking and human smuggling elements that do happen along the border. That has always been the case wherever there is migration happening.
Mhm.
People are vulnerable to being taken advantage of. What I
Mhm.
would say is most of that illegal activity happens at legal ports of entry and not in between borders. So that is a very big common misconception. It's like you just have a bunch of coyotes and smugglers just taking children under a tunnel across the border. Like that's not what's going on. What's happening is that you have this high amount of people, and most of which are here to seek asylum. Now, that does not mean that everybody is coming will be granted asylum. So the thing that we have to shift is, so that's very true, those numbers and those encounters are high. What is not necessarily true, or that what I would say is needs more context and nuance, is that the vast majority of people showing up at the border are looking for Border Patrol agents. They are looking for our authorities because according to international law, if you submit yourself to those authorities in the government, in the United States, you can ask to seek asylum. And so you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are showing up to say this: please vet my story.
Mm.
Please, I'm submitting myself to the authority of the United States to vet me to see if I do have a well founded fear of persecution. And some of those people are coming because of poverty, and that does not qualify you for asylum. So a lot of those people will be deported and expelled back or repatriated back. But the reality is under international and US law, you do have the right to seek asylum in this country. And so what you have to look for in these kind of images and pictures is, it's not that there is like utter chaos and people are just running rampant. It's like you'll see rows and rows and rows and rows of people, or like a group of people, and then you'll see a Border Patrol van, and a couple border patrol agents. And these people are trying to be as orderly as possible. Many of them don't speak the language. They're not mostly coming from Mexico. They're coming from around the world. We're talking about Brazil. We're talking about China. We're talking about Ukrainians showing up there. We're talking, I mean, it's not Mexicans. They're like the minority of who's showing up at the border. And it'll be rare that they seek or that they qualify for asylum. So the reality is that when you look closely, people are trying to, as orderly as possible, submit themselves to the full authority of the government.
And tell me about then, like these women when they go on these trip, what are the big misconceptions or the change in either understanding or in heart that is happening as they encounter these realities that you're describing?
I think the biggest aha is that this is far more complicated than just illegal versus illegal.
Okay.
And that hopefully what they're walking away with is a broader biblical understanding of who is showing up at the border. I'll give you a very short story about the last time I was down in Tijuana and I was at a shelter. And it was a church that turned into a shelter. And this pastor was walking the streets of his neighborhood at night and he encountered a family that was sleeping on the street. And he said, "What are you sleeping on the street for?" And they said, "The shelter. We've been at the shelter for 3 days. We're turned out," because the shelter's on the Mexican side. The Mexican church is shouldering so much of the burden of this migration that's happening. And he said, "Come sleep in my church." And then just kind of, he started encountering more and more and more people. So he went to his wife and he's like, "I think we should turn the church into a shelter." And she was like, "No, I don't want to do that. We are called to pastor this church. And it was like so many people kept coming that they turned the church into a shelter. He dies from COVID. So it's like, this is his vision. This is what he's turned his church into, is ministering to the least of these who are migrating from around the world. And he dies during COVID. And so his wife picks up the mantle. She gets ordained as a pastor. And they were part of the SBC church. Well, she's not supposed to get ordained as a pastor. And so they disfellowed her church for her taking up that mantle and becoming a trained pastor. That's sad. Here's the saddest part. When you walk into the shelter, that first wall you see is all different flags from different countries. And each flag represents a nation that has come into her door, who's come into her church. There were 36 different flags on that wall. So here you have the broader big church saying, "Go and do missions, go and complete the big, the greatest commission of all, and do these, go." And yet the world is showing up at America's doorstep, and we're saying, no, we don't want you. We want to go to where you are, and then we want to come back home. We don't want to welcome you into our communities necessarily. And so what you had this woman who's now a pastor, and she's just fierce in her own right. She is ministering to the nations at the church that she turned into a shelter with her husband. And she is doing the work of meeting the hands and feet of Jesus. And it's just pretty amazing. And so you have these ladies who come in and they're like, wow. First of all, women can do amazing things. Second of all, the world is here. How does that change the way in which my church is investing? How does that change the way in which I think about global missions, how I think about the Great Commission, when I don't actually have to travel that far? There are asylum seekers that are in my neighborhood, and that proximity thing comes into play. So I think some of the biggest ahas are, this is really complicated. It doesn't mean I can't do anything. It means I need to lean into my Bible more, because that actually anchors me in this. And I also need to start getting close to people. And that proximity will be the powerful thing that changes pretty much everything.
Bri, you said lean into the Bible. And as well as understand the complexity of the actual current situation. You've given us a really helpful picture of the current situation, how much more complex it is, that it isn't simply a case of being overrun at the border, but it's actually these multiple sort of streams of immigrants, often not from Central America or Mexico, people coming in from oftentimes fleeing violence, some with a case for asylum, sometimes with not, really sounds like border patrol agents. I mean, I think that's also a helpful correction, like from the progressive side of sort of this evil border patrol that's, just hunting people. It sounds like these are people trying to do their jobs that are trying to actually serve
It's
people.
just like the police here in the US, right? You're gonna
Yeah.
have some good apples, you're gonna have some really bad apples, and everybody's just trying to like do their job. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really helpful just picture of complexity on the ground, which always, I think, complexity is so important because it leads to humility, because it leads to recognition. Oh, I don't
Yeah.
know the full story. I need to learn.
Right.
I want to go back to the biblical side, our part of it, leaning more into scripture. We talked about trying to really apply Genesis 1:26, the Imago Dei, to the whole being. We talked
Mm-hmm.
about just the biblical narrative of how many immigrants and refugees all of our biblical heroes are, so that God seems to have some particular way of working through human history and human beings through immigrants and refugees. What else? What else do you draw from scripture, and do you
Mm-hmm.
really want your women exposed to scripture to help them think and feel with God's heart towards the immigrant and the refugee?
I mean, if we go back to like rereading some of the things that have just been so ingrained in us growing up,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
like Daniel in the lion's den, and him and his friends were in exile when all of this
Yeah.
happened, and they were in a land not their own. But I mean, when you go back to like the Old Testament and you think about the first migration was really Adam being kicked out of the garden, right? And then
Right.
Abram was told to go to a land he didn't know. And so,
Yeah.
sometimes people in the Bible are migrating because um, God has just straight up told them to go. Sometimes it's because of war. Sometimes it's because of a famine. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's because of family dynamics and you have to escape or separate in some way. But I mean, really, Nicholas Walterstorff was a theologian at Yale,
Yep.
and he came up with this kind of concept of the quartet of the vulnerable in the Old
Mm.
Testament. And Timothy Keller loved this so much he picked it up and wrote about it in his book, his one of his books. I can't remember. He has so many amazing ones. But
Yeah.
and basically it was is there are four vulnerable populations that are uplifted in the Old Testament more than any other populations. And it's the sojourner, the widow, the orphan, and the poor.
Yeah.
And you always see that laws are being made to protect them, practices and kind of like religious ways of doing life were constantly including provisions for these vulnerable populations. The native should have, the immigrant should have the same law as the native born. You should, glean your harvest, but then don't go back a second time. You
That's
should
right.
leave it for those who are sojourning.
Yeah. The
So
gleanings. Yeah.
yeah, so you have in the Old Testament just these constant mention and these constant provisions, and so you start to understand what God's heart is for those who are uniquely vulnerable. Not to mention that ger, the word in the Old Testament, is mentioned over 90 times, and that is the word for stranger and for sojourner.
Yes.
So there's just this
Yes.
constant theme. And remember, you were once strangers yourselves. You were once, in a land not your own. In Exodus, we know the great migration that happened out of Exodus. And then you get to the New Testament, and the Lord's like, Jesus interacts with so many different people that there's not some kind of elevation of one vulnerable population. But he says in Matthew 25, as when you meet the hungry, when you clothe the naked, when you feed the sick or take care of the sick, and you visit those in prison and you take care of the sojourner, you have actually done that to God himself. And when
Hmm.
you haven't done those things, when you haven't gotten in that close of proximity to meet those needs of those vulnerable people, you have not done it to me. I will not recognize you when you get to heaven. And so you have really this huge theme of care and concern and provision for vulnerable people, particularly immigrants, widows, orphans, and the poor in the Old Testament. And then you have basically every biblical major character in the Old Testament being an immigrant themselves. And then you get to the New Testament and Jesus just kind of levels the playing field and says, love your God, the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And who is your neighbor? And that lawyer was like, yeah, who is my neighbor? As if he was kind of asking the Lord, I know I have some non-neighbors, right? Like there are
Yeah.
definitely probably some people you're not referring to. And Jesus
Yeah.
is like, no, I'm not referring to that. So your neighbor is the person who's showing up at the border, and their heartbeat just might, like you as a pro-life Christian would fight for the heartbeat of a child in utero. there is a heartbeat of a child at the border that
Yeah.
also needs your advocacy and does not have a voice. I encountered a woman on one of my trips, and she in a shelter, and she had been deported. She had been detained in the U.S. with her kids, and then she'd been deported. And she said, she just in tears, she was like, "I am so sorry that I stepped on your territory." This is what she said to me. "I'm
Mm.
so sorry that I stepped on your territory. I just had no other choice with my kids. I was fleeing violence. I didn't have a voice, and yet they treated me like I wasn't human. Like, and I felt so violated." And she was talking about her experience in detention. And
Mm.
as she's saying this to me, I'm
Yeah.
thinking about all the biblical things that are like going through my mind. But then I'm also just thinking about my convictions as a biblical pro-life Christian. And I'm just like, these are the same things. What she's telling me are the same exact things I would say in any conversation about abortion. We would say
Yeah.
that preborn children are without a voice, that
Yeah.
people do not think that they're human, that they are trying to escape and elude violence, the violent
Yeah.
practice of abortion. And so, and she was, she was describing these things, and I was just thinking, this makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And just biblically speaking, she is my neighbor, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
from old to new, and not to mention that Jesus and his family himself were refugees, fleeing fleeing the government, fleeing political oppression,
Yeah.
going in the middle of the night, not having anything, not having anywhere to lay their head, and relying on the mercy and welcome of others.
Yeah.
um, so just kind of revisiting some of these things that were like, oh, that's a nice story. What is the person behind the story having to do in this story? And it just kind of
Yeah.
changes so much.
Bri, I want you to connect this biblical heart for the refugee, for the stranger, the migrant, with how we've actually been treating them in historically at the border. Because I don't think people realize some of the dehumanizing, really
Mm.
image violating practices. You can say, okay, we still need to control things at the border. We need to have
Oh yeah.
orderly entry. I think, we can agree on that. But you can do that in a humanizing way, and you can do that in a dehumanizing way, in a way that really
Yeah.
violates the image of God in others. Talk about what's happened historically in the past with some of the dehumanizing practices. I'm thinking especially about the child separation practices
Yeah.
and policy that happened under the previous administration. I don't think enough Americans, and especially enough American Christians, realize what was government practice and policy in terms of family separation and child separation. So can you tell people what was happening? Again, in this, it was an actual systematic practice and policy of the previous administration.
Yeah. So we will always say at Women of Welcome that we want to hold the tension, and we do our level best to hold the tension of, we advocate for safe and secure borders. We also advocate for humane treatment of people who are arriving at those borders. And so it's not that we feel like we have to compromise the safety and the structure of what we've got going on. We believe very much in thorough vetting, which we think our government does a really great job vetting. So we will say that, and say, all right, with that in mind, there has to be a prioritization of people, right? It's not that we have to devalue and deprioritize safety to value people. And so what was happening in the previous administration, like I mentioned, it's Congress who makes immigration law. So we need to be calling our elected officials to say, hey, this is your job, to work across the aisle and create safe and humane policy, right? So this is what we have to do. But what happened is that we have these, executive orders that come out from the administration, and usually they only last during that administration, and a lot of times they get held up in court and whatnot. It's basically like the administration's interpretation of certain laws that we have, and the leveraging of certain caveats that we have in the law, or loopholes or whatnot. So in the previous administration, one of the deterrence factors that they wanted to do was, they wanted to say, all right, if you come to America and you have children, what we're going to do is we're going to charge the parents. That's a misdemeanor crime, but what we're going to do is we're going to charge the parents federally, and that means that they're going to have to be held in a federal detention center. Well, kids, according to the Flores Agreement, that's another thing we don't want to get to, they're not allowed to be detained in federal centers, and so that would automatically separate you from your kids if you're a parent. And so what the previous administration knew is, all right, if we do this, if we enact the zero tolerance policy, where we basically charge everybody that's coming, And this will separate kids, and this will intimidate and deter families from coming.
And I should just
And
add, the news journalist, there are numerous journalistic examinations of the execution and the motivations that went in that policy. That was an explicit aim of the previous administration, was to create conditions of separation of families that would actually be so devastating and
that it would be a
so
deterrent. Yeah.
it would actually have a deterrent effect. They wanted it to be a cruel experience as a way to actually deter people from coming. So
And we
continue.
don't say that because, and we don't say that because we think that or because that's actually what happened. We say that because there were White House memos that were leaked about all of the
this is well
conversation.
documented.
It's very well documented that
Yeah.
it was an intentional thing to try and deter people. What it ended up doing is it ended up separating over 5,000 families and re-traumatizing children in a country not their own and putting them in a center. And
just let's be clear what happened. Let's be clear what's happening. These were kids young as 3, 4, 5 years old,
infants,
being
yes.
forcibly removed from their parents, placed in another facility than their parents, and then no communication between the child and the family. Right. And then in some cases, them getting lost, like that, not like it's only we're right in the middle of a very torturous process of trying to even reunite some of these families after is it months, years of separation?
It's been years. And so you had over 5,000 families that were separated. And what they, in this rush to do this deterrence, there was a couple things that happened. They rushed to do this so much that they did not have a system in place to pair parents with kids. So they just separated them. So you have kids who are 3, they don't even know their last name, what country they came from. They can't even verbalize that they need to, go to the bathroom. It's like, and so these families were separated and there was no mechanism to reunite them. And so the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to put together a family reunification task force. And they have reunited all but a couple hundred as much as possible. But the hard part about that is these families are coming to the US and they don't have the means and the resources to help their kid through, EMDR and PTSD therapy and all the things that their kids are going to need to actually be set up because their kids were separated from them and they don't know why. So you had this horrible separation happening with these families. And yet, when you talk to the women who were separated from their kids, some of them did not know that was going to happen. The ones that did said, I had no other option. If you can imagine that this was my best option, was that my kid was going to be fed. And I never even imagined that the government of the United States of America wouldn't immediately see that I'm not a trafficker and that they're probably just separating us they didn't know why they were separating them. And then reunite me with my son. And then but that's not what happened. And so they were entrusting themselves to the U.S. government and their children to the U.S. government. And that's not what ended up happening because that's not the reason why they were separated in the first place. So you still have families to this day, I think it's like 5 years later, that are still not reunified because what happened was in that we needed to empty out detention centers. And so these parents, thousands of them got deported back to their home country and their kids are still in the Office of Refugee Resettlement Centers here in the U.S. with no plans and no mechanism, no information to reunite them. And some of them are coming from villages that don't speak mainstream language, and so it's like these dialects are super hard. And how do you verify? And I mean, it's just turned into a mess. The other thing that happened from that is that once word got out, it didn't deter people. You know what it did? It provided a very perverse incentive for people who are already super desperate to send their kids across without them. So what you had is and it'll make me pretty emotional, but what you had is you can see it on Border Patrol footage. I've watched it. You can see kids with pinned numbers or markered numbers on their arms. And you can see their parents sitting in the brush and sending them to the wall by themselves. You have like a 10-year-old brother with 2 siblings younger than him, and he's walking them hand in hand as their mom is waiting in the bushes because the U.S. government wouldn't take them together. And so it created this kind of like, if you're desperate, I think this is one of the things when I got involved in this work because I got invited on a trip. And when I went on that trip, I was down, I didn't go to the border. I went to down to like the heart of southern Mexico, which is Oaxaca, Mexico. And I was there for 4 days. And I was taken to a shelter for unaccompanied children. And these are children that had either been lost or left by their parents there at that shelter. And I was showing up to that shelter with a ton of judgment. I'm like, who leaves their kid at a shelter and then continues on to the US to seek a better life? You know, I'm like super. And how do you lose your kid? Well, I mean, Jesus's parents lost his kid for, you know, their kid for 3 days, but, you know, with no judgment. So it's like, I'm showing up with a lot of judgment. Like, who are these parents? And what I encountered at that shelter was just, it broke so much in me. And that is, as I encountered an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old who are both mothers.
Wow.
And, you know, any reasonable person would know that that is not something that a child would choose.
Yeah.
To be a mother at that age. And so what I came to learn was these girls had been violated in their home countries and their mothers were bringing them, trying to get them to safety to the US.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not always to the US. Sometimes it's to a bigger Mexican city or something like that. But they're trying to get to the US and their daughters are pregnant along the way. They don't have health care. They can't feed themselves. They're walking on foot. They're sometimes, you know, trying to evade cartels and traffickers and territorial, you know, drug lord gang, you know, disputes and things. It's just such a treacherous, horrific, traumatizing trip. And we know that a majority of women are sexually assaulted along the journey to the southern, you know, to the southern border. So you have all these dangers and there's already vulnerable. They've already been violated. And the best thing that their moms could have done was to say, all right, my daughter's going to deliver here. I don't have money to feed us on this journey. What I'm going to do is I'm going to entrust them to this shelter that will help them deliver the baby, will help them feed the baby, give the baby health care, give my daughter health care. And I will continue on to seek asylum in the US and I will send for them because I know where they are and I know they're being taken care of. Like, can you even imagine that that's your option? Your option is to continue on with your pregnant 11-year-old, thousands of more miles, or leave them at a shelter for them to deliver on their own so that you can have the best chance of going in between these crazy policies that the US is enforcing to try and get asylum and seek for her. So I walked away completely dismantled. I was like, I'm not hearing this story in the US. Why am I not being told this story about what is happening in these other countries that is the push factor for people to come to our border? And not everybody that's coming to the border will qualify for asylum. Not everyone coming to the border has good intentions. There are definitely nefarious characters that need to be stopped. And that's why I always say, like, safe and secure borders, humane treatment of people who want to be processed and submit themselves to the full vetting of our country. So it just gets more complicated as you see what's happening. And we have a very sordid and racially motivated history when it comes to immigration policy and law. And I didn't really think that before. I didn't even think race had anything to do with immigration before. But it's like baked into the system when you look at, and I don't mean that to scare any kind of like conservatives who are like, oh, we're going down into the slippery slope of all of the things. What I mean by that is that doing your homework about how we got to where we are today with our immigration policies and what's happening, you realize that there is a real disparity in the situation we find ourselves in. And so, it's vastly more complicated, and it's not just illegal versus illegal. I wish it was that simple because then I feel like the solutions could be simple, but it's not.
Yeah. All right, we're back with Bri Stensrud, and we are been talking about some of the complexity, and the emotional and moral complexities that we encounter when we really discover both what's actually happening at the border, what's happening at the countries that are sending streams of migrants, and the horrific conditions that drive migrants and asylum seekers to go through some just amazing hardships, and then even sacrifice their kids in order to just try to get them to a better life. It tugs at my heart. That's the story of my family life. I'm an immigrant. My parents were able to come over to this country really to seek a better life for us. And the thought of them having to be driven to such desperate situations that they would like send to us and kind of over the border, maybe metaphorically. Really, it undoes me at a certain level.
Mm,
Bri, how I wanted to shift to then. So you're giving women this experience that is kind of blows their mind in terms of the actual complexity of what's happening on the ground, as well as emotionally, I'm sure challenges them as they experience sort of the suffering and the hardship that they when they're coming from their home communities, they don't experience. But then they
mm,
go back to communities, and you said even sometimes families or
families.
marriages that don't see it the way they do. um, that is also an exile experience, as we talked about before. They have now become an exile. Their encounter with the exile, in a lesser way, not to equate it, it's, theirs is an emotional or social exile, not nearly as painful, but in some ways that's the nature of suffering. You come into contact with one kind of suffering, and if you at all open your heart and mind to it, that suffering enters you in some way. And so these women, as they have opened their heart and minds to the experience of the exile, now have become exiles themselves. They're not fully at home, perhaps even in their own home, in terms of politically, socially, culturally, and so forth. Um, let's shift the view to that experience of exile. What is that like, and how do you help? How do you help women navigate that experience now?
I mean, so that's the beauty of the Women of Welcome community. We're mostly online, but we do have resources that you can start Bible studies and explore with other kind of like minded, curious friends of yours in your own community. But that's just the beauty of the community. We are, over 150,000 women who are in this community who are curious as well. So you're not alone. And I think that's of huge comfort to meet people. But in your own home, when you're experiencing, backlash for going or whatever that may be, I'll tell you a story that will answer this.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I was speaking at a church at DBU down in Dallas, or I was speaking at the campus. And I had a woman come up to me after my talk, and she was just like, "Oh my goodness, I'm so, so happy to, meet you and know about Women of Welcome." And she said, "I have been consuming everything that you guys put out resource wise in the community, and I've been super active in your private group and all these things." And she said, "I wanted to go on one of your border trips, but I didn't get selected to go." And I said, "I know, they fill up so fast. I'm so sorry." And she said, "You know what? I couldn't wait. So I took a friend. We went down to the border ourselves." And I said, "What?" Her name's Carla. I love her. I'm like, "You did what?" And she was like, "Yeah, I just could not wait. I needed to see for myself what was going on." And so we went down there, and then we got involved with a church down there. And I brought all these resources back to my pastor. And I've just been on fire. I had no idea that God could light that kind of a passion in me. And I have just been serving and helping resettle families that have been coming ever since. And so we all kind of like, hugged her and encouraged her, whatnot. And then I pulled her off to the side and I said, "I heard, you went with some friends down to the border and you've got, kind of a volunteer community." I said, "How's it at home?" And she got really quiet. And she said, "Well, that's where it's been really hard." She said, "My family is really combative about it. My husband is really, really right leaning and politically minded. And my kids don't understand why I've all of a sudden care about these people who don't look like us and who are just coming to take from us." And she said, "It's been very stressful in my marriage. It's been
Hmm.
super hard with my kids. My kids don't even think that they know me anymore." And so we just sat there and just, and I pray for Carla because this is something, when Jesus was like, told, "Hey, your mother and father, your mother and your brother are here." And he's like, who is my family?
No.
I'm called to do the work of my father. And I can't let other people get in the way of that. I mean, that's so hard to say when your marriage has stress because you have decided to get in closer proximity to people in pain that they haven't experienced. So there's the reality is coming back from these trips, there's a huge amount of dissonance, and it can be personal. It could also be familial. It could be like, usually when I come back from trips, I have a very hard time taking communion at my church.
Hmm.
We take communion at the wall together. And so I just am remembering the last moment that I took communion. And I'm just thinking, This is a radical kind of welcome that Christ extends to us. And there's so much noise around welcoming people that it's just so hard to be that intimately aware of what Christ's welcome is to us and what ours should be to other people, according to Matthew
Mm,
25, you know? And what does it look like to actually really love your neighbor well? Because if you loved someone as you love yourself, you're seeing yourself as that woman at the border who's begging for compassion at our doorstep.
yeah.
And so your conscience is just shocked. And you start to see things and notice things that maybe you didn't before, and your comfortable, curated life feels a little out of whack. And I think that's a holy dissonance that's happening. I think the Holy Spirit is waking up stuff. And I also think that it's very scary to grow in your confidence um, about the compassion God has given you, because you will get criticism for that confidence. And so what you have is you have a lot of women who go home, and it will be okay, and they will have a community of people who are really hungry to learn and to listen. And then there will be other people who will go home, and when I have my follow-up calls with ladies, they'll say, no one's asked me about it. And I think that's on purpose, you know. And so there's just a wide range of what that is. There's a range of welcome that the church is willing to offer in this country, and that's just, we're no stranger to that.
Well, Bri, I'm so glad that Women of Welcome exists to provide both that experience of exposure, the biblical formation, but also this ongoing emotional and social support that it seems like women who
Yeah.
are on this journey need in an ongoing way. Let's wrap up by you sharing more resources that you have for either women who have experienced something like that or are interested in experiencing something like that. What resources exist and what's coming out?
Yeah. So Women of Welcome has, I think, about eight, I think 7 or 8 Bible studies that are free. All of our resources are free. We have everything from what is Christ like welcome? What does the Bible say about immigration? How to be bold and brave. It's a study about Exodus 1 and 2. I mean, just how to be a peacemaker, move from a peacekeeper to a peacemaker, some of these things. So we have Bible studies. We have a documentary film that was filmed with Latasha Morrison from Be the Bridge and Heather McFadden from the Don't Mom Alone podcast. So we have just a lot of free resources at womenofwelcome.com. I think our latest resource that would be most helpful at this time, unless you really want to dive into a Bible study, is I've got a book that's just coming out. It's out for pre-order this week. It's called Start with Welcome. And that has discussion questions after every chapter that you can use that as a small group or just reflective for yourself. But Start with Welcome is about the journey to a confident and compassionate immigration conversation, and how you can start that journey too, and that it's scary, and that's fine to be scared, and it's fine to also know some things. But where did Christ start with us? I mean, his welcome was just unashamed and unrestricted. And that does not mean that, you know, don't have the border wall coming down flags in your mind. What I mean is it's a heart posture.
Yeah.
It's a heart posture for the church. And so Start with Welcome is a book that you can pre-order wherever books are sold now. But if you want something free that's good and tangible and that you can do with other ladies as well, we have plenty of resources at womenofwelcome.com that are great for you to take a part
Well,
of.
we'll put links to all of that in the show notes, and it sounds like, yeah, you can really encourage listeners to check out Start with Welcome, and we'll put that link in the show notes. Bri, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us your story. It's an important story for every American to think about how we as a country are living out the biblical mandate to love the stranger, to love the migrant. Thanks so much, Bri.
Thanks for having me, Curtis.
And listeners, once again, since we are all in one way or another exiles moving through this world, we welcome you back next week when we once again gather around the campfire.